Number 1. The South-Pointing Chariot. Picture a wooden cart rolling along a dusty road in ancient China. On top of it stands a small carved figure of a robed official, one arm held rigidly outward. No matter how the cart turns, no matter how the road bends, that little arm keeps pointing in the same direction. It points south, always south, and it does this with no magnet, no lodestone, nothing that senses the earth at all. It does it with gears. The story begins with an argument. In the court of the Kingdom of Wei, around the year 235 AD, officials were debating an old legend. Tradition said the Yellow Emperor and the Duke of Zhou, more than 1,000 years earlier, had built a chariot that could always find south. Most of the court thought this was a fairy tale. One engineer disagreed. His name was Ma Jun, and rather than argue, he built one. What Ma Jun built is the remarkable part. To keep that figure aimed south through every turn, his chariot almost certainly used a differential gear train. Now, think about what a differential does in a modern car. When your car turns a corner, the outer wheel travels farther than the inner wheel, so the two wheels must spin at different speeds. The differential gear in your rear axle is the clever piece of engineering that allows this. It measures the difference between the two wheels and distributes power between them. The South-Pointing Chariot uses that exact same idea, but in reverse. As the chariot turns, one road wheel rotates more than the other. That difference feeds through a train of gears, and the gears counter-rotate the pointer figure by an equal and opposite amount. The turning of the vehicle and the turning of the figure cancel out perfectly. The arm never moves relative to the ground. It just keeps pointing south. This is the same principle sitting inside nearly every car on the road today. And it appeared in China roughly 16 centuries before it became common in European machinery. The historian Joseph Needham, who spent his life documenting Chinese science, treated this device as a landmark of ancient mechanical engineering. Later, Chinese builders kept the tradition alive, including Zhuchongji in the 5th century AD, the same mathematician who calculated pi to 7 decimal places. Here is the frustrating truth. No original chariot survives. Everything we know comes from written descriptions in texts like the Book of Song. So there is genuine debate about the exact mechanism. Most reconstructions favor the differential gear, but some scholars argue Ma Jun used a clutch or an escapement system that engaged and disengaged as the cart turned. We may never know for certain which design he chose. And there is a deeper limitation. The device only worked if both wheels were exactly the same diameter and never slipped on the ground. Over a long, muddy road, small errors would add up, and the pointer would drift. This was a ceremonial marvel, a symbol of imperial sophistication, not a practical tool for finding your way across a country. In the end, the magnetic compass, another Chinese invention, proved far more useful, and the mechanical chariot faded. But hold on to that gear idea, because the problem Ma Jun solved, translating the motion of wheels into a controlled output, is exactly the kind of problem that later clockwork and analog computers would wrestle with. He had a piece of the future in his hands, and then it slipped away. Number 2. The Haya steel furnaces. Near the western shore of Lake Victoria, in what is now northwestern Tanzania, live a people called the Haya. And for a long time, textbooks told a simple story about metal. They said that real, high-carbon steel, made with a preheated air blast, was a modern European achievement, perfected in the industrial age. That story turned out to be wrong by nearly 2,000 years. In the 1970s, an anthropologist named Peter Schmidt and a metallurgist named Donald Avery went to the Buhaya region to study the local ironworking tradition. What they found, published in the journal Science around 1978, upended assumptions about African metallurgy. Radiocarbon dates from furnace sites suggested that people here had been smelting iron for around 2,000 years and doing it at a level of sophistication that shocked the researchers. The furnaces were cone-shaped, built from mud and old slag, standing about 1.5 meters tall. Underneath sat a pit packed with charcoal made from swamp grass. Reeds and clay pipes, called tuyères, fed air into the base of the furnace. And here is the crucial trick. As the air traveled through those clay pipes, which sat in the heat of the furnace, the air itself was preheated before it reached the burning charcoal. That single detail is everything. Preheating the incoming air raised the temperature inside to an estimated 1,300 to 1,400 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to produce medium carbon steel, not just the softer, lower-grade iron that most ancient furnaces made. And the swampgrass charcoal did double duty, creating the chemical environment that let carbon bond into the iron to form steel. Now, compare that to Europe. The technique of preheating the air blast, known as hot blast, was patented by a Scottish engineer named James Beaumont Nielsen in 1828. The Haya were using the same fundamental principle around 18 centuries earlier. When Schmidt worked with Haya elders, they were able to reconstruct a working furnace from inherited knowledge and memory, even though large-scale traditional smelting had mostly stopped generations before. Why had it stopped? Not because it failed. The Haya steel industry was erased by economics. When European colonial trade flooded East Africa with cheap imported iron and steel, local smelting could not compete. The specialist families who held the knowledge stopped practicing it. Within a few generations, a technology 2,000 years in the making survived only in the memories of a handful of old men. There is honest scientific debate here. Some archaeologists have questioned whether every firing consistently reached the steel range, or whether the results varied. That is a fair challenge, and it is how science works. But the broader point stands. This was advanced, independently invented metallurgy in sub-Saharan Africa, and it directly contradicts the old idea that such technology only arose in Eurasia. So ask yourself, if the preheated blast principle had been written down and shared widely, instead of held quietly in a few families, and then wiped out by cheap imports, how much sooner might high-carbon steel have spread across the world? The knowledge existed. The world just never got to keep it. Number 3. Mesoamerican vulcanized rubber. When you hear the word vulcanization, you probably think of Charles Goodyear, the American inventor who patented the process of toughening rubber with sulfur in 1844. It gave us durable tires and countless modern products. But the peoples of ancient Mesoamerica were doing something chemically similar more than 3,000 years before Goodyear was born. The Olmec civilization, whose very name given by the Aztecs means the rubber people, were processing latex from the Castilla elastica tree by around 1600 BC. On its own, raw latex is sticky and quickly rots. To make it useful, you need to change its chemistry, and that is exactly what these ancient artisans figured out how to do. The breakthrough in understanding how came from a team at MIT, including the researcher Dorothy Hostler, whose work around 1999 cracked the puzzle. They discovered that Mesoamericans blended the raw latex with juice from the morning glory vine. That vine juice contains sulfur-bearing compounds, and those compounds cross-link the long polymer chains in the rubber, exactly the kind of molecular bonding that gives vulcanized rubber its strength and bounce. Even more impressive, they could tune the recipe. By adjusting the ratio of latex to morning glory juice, they could make a material with more bounce, ideal for the rubber balls used in their famous ball game. Or they could make it more durable, good for the soles of sandals. Or more flexible, useful as an adhesive or a binding. This was practical materials science, worked out entirely by experiment, without any modern understanding of chemistry. Those rubber balls were not toys. The Mesoamerican ball game was played in great stone courts across the region for thousands of years, and it carried deep religious meaning, sometimes linked to human sacrifice. Some ceremonial balls weighed several kilograms. Rubber was also burned as incense, offered to the gods, shaped into figurines, and used to waterproof cloth. The Aztec state demanded thousands of rubber balls every year as tribute, a fact recorded in colonial-era documents like the Codex Mendoza. When the Spanish arrived, they were astonished. Nothing in Europe bounced the way these balls did. Chroniclers at the court of Moctezuma wrote about it with genuine wonder. And then, as with so much else, the conquest brought collapse. Ball games were suppressed, populations were devastated by disease and violence, and the specialized knowledge of how to make this remarkable material faded. The exact recipe had to be rediscovered by modern chemists analyzing ancient samples. This is a completely independent invention of durable rubber technology, arrived at through botany rather than the sulfur and heat industrial route that Goodyear used. It shows that advanced materials could emerge from a deep knowledge of plants, with no metal industry driving it at all. Rubber decays easily, so physical samples are rare, which makes that chemical detective work all the more important. And it leaves us with the same haunting question. If this knowledge of waterproofing, sealing, and elastic materials had spread around the globe, what might the world have built with it thousands of years early? Number 4. The Hierapolis Sawmill. At the ancient city of Hierapolis, in modern Turkey near the White Terraces of Pamukkale, archaeologists found a carving on a stone coffin. The coffin belonged to a mill owner named Marcus Aurelius Ammianus, and it dates to around the 3rd century AD. The carving looks simple at first. It shows a water wheel and a machine for cutting stone. But that machine contains one of the most important mechanical ideas in all of history. The relief shows the water wheel connected, through a rod and a crank, to a frame holding a saw. As the wheel turns, the crank and connecting rod convert that smooth, circular motion into a back-and-forth motion, driving the saw forward and back to cut blocks of stone. This is the earliest known depiction of a crank and connecting rod mechanism anywhere in the world. Now, why does that matter so much? Because converting rotary motion into reciprocating back and forth motion, or the reverse, is the single most important trick in the machinery of the modern world. It is the exact motion at the heart of every steam engine and every internal combustion engine. When the pistons in a car engine push up and down and turn the crankshaft, they are running this Roman mechanism in reverse. The Romans had the core motion of the industrial age carved onto a tomb. The discovery was published by the German scholar Klaus Grue and colleagues around 2007, and it forced historians to rethink Roman engineering. And this was not a one-off curiosity. Similar water-powered stone saws have been identified at Gerasa in modern Jordan and at Ephesus. The Roman poet Ausonius, writing in the 4th century, even described water-powered saws cutting marble along the Moselle River in his poem about that region. The technology was real, and it was spreading. The Romans were masters of water power. At Barbegal, in southern France, they built a complex of 16 water wheels, stepped down a hillside, an industrial flour mill of remarkable scale. But grinding grain uses simple rotary motion. The Hierapolis saw is different. It couples water power to a reciprocating tool. That is a genuine leap. So why did this world-changing idea not launch an industrial revolution 1,800 years early? Part of the answer is fragility. The knowledge lived in working practice and in a few monuments, not in a widely copied engineering manual that could survive the centuries. This carving is essentially an accidental blueprint in stone. It was recorded because a proud mill owner wanted to boast about his clever, profitable machine, not because anyone was trying to teach the principle to the future. When the Western Roman world collapsed, evidence for the crank and connecting rod largely vanished from Europe, only to re-emerge much later in medieval and Renaissance machines. Reconstructions confirm that the arrangement shown on the coffin genuinely works and fits with Roman water wheel technology. The Romans held the beating heart of the steam engine in their hands, and then, for more than 1,000 years, the world forgot it. Number 5. Al-Jazari's Programmable Automata. In the year 1206, a scholar and engineer named Ismail Al-Jazari finished a book at the Artukid court in the city of Amid, in what is now southeastern Turkey. The book was called The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, and it described about 50 machines, complete with instructions for building them. Among those machines were devices that we would today recognize as programmable robots. His most famous creation is the elephant clock. It was a deliberate showpiece of world cultures, combining an Indian elephant, an Egyptian phoenix, Arabian figures, Greek water technology, and Chinese dragons, all working together to tell time through an elaborate sequence of automatic movements. But the truly forward-looking machines were the ones you could reprogram. Al-Jazari built a boat carrying mechanical musicians that could float on a lake at a party. The musicians played drums, and the rhythm they played was set by pegs arranged on a rotating drum inside the machine. Move the pegs to different positions, and the machine would play a different rhythm. That is programming, a physical, mechanical form of programming, 7 centuries before anything we would call a computer. This peg and drum principle is the direct ancestor of the music box and the barrel organ. His inventiveness went further. He described a hand-washing automaton that presented soap and a towel with a mechanism to flush the used water away, a concept pointing toward the modern flush toilet. His machines contain some of the earliest clear descriptions of the camshaft and the crankshaft. He used segmental gears, escapements, and self-regulating systems that were centuries ahead of anything comparable in Europe. Some of his water clocks could even be adjusted to track the changing length of daylight hours across the seasons, another form of reprogramming. The historian of technology Donald Hill translated Al-Jazari's treatise in 1974, bringing this genius to a wide modern audience. And scholars place Al-Jazari in a chain of transmission that helped feed the development of European clockwork and automation. He was building on the work of others too, especially the Banu Musa brothers, 3 siblings in 9th century Baghdad who wrote their own book of ingenious devices. Here is what makes Al-Jazari's case different from a lost manuscript. His book survived. It exists in many copies. The knowledge was not physically destroyed, and yet the transformative potential, the idea of programmable, self-controlling machines as a foundation for automation and robotics, still did not take root and industrialize in its home region. These were marvels for the palace, spectacles to display a ruler's sophistication, rather than tools for reshaping labor and production. So this is a subtler kind of erasure, not knowledge burned or scraped away, but a brilliant idea preserved on the page and simply never carried forward into the world it could have transformed. The blueprint for programmable machines sat waiting in a book for 700 years. What might have happened if someone had picked it up and asked, what else could this do? Number 6. Archimedes' lost method. Archimedes of Syracuse, who lived in the 3rd century BC, is often called the greatest mathematician of the ancient world, and one of his most astonishing works nearly vanished from history entirely, scraped off a page and painted over with prayers. Its recovery is one of the great detective stories of science. The work is called The Method of Mechanical Theorems. In it, Archimedes revealed how he actually discovered his results, and his technique was breathtaking. He imagined a shape as being made of infinitely many, infinitely thin slices, and he balanced those slices against each other as if on a lever, to find areas and volumes. This is, in essence, the core idea of integral calculus, the mathematics that would not be formally developed until Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz worked it out in the late 17th century. Archimedes was reaching toward it nearly 1900 years earlier. Here is how close we came to losing it forever. The method survived into modern times in just a single manuscript. That manuscript was what scholars call a palimpsest. In the medieval world, parchment was scarce and expensive, so old books were sometimes scraped clean and written over. Around the year 1229, a monk took a 10th century copy of Archimedes' mathematical works, scraped off the text, cut up the pages, and reused them to make a Christian prayer book. Archimedes' calculus was hidden beneath the prayers. In 1906, a Danish scholar named Johann Ludwig Heiberg tracked the manuscript down in Constantinople and, using a magnifying glass and photographs, was able to read the faint traces of the original mathematics beneath the religious text. He revealed the method to the world for the first time. But then the manuscript vanished again during the turmoil of the 20th century. It resurfaced at auction at Christie's in 1998, where it sold for around $2 million. By then, it was in terrible condition, damaged by mold and fire, worn by centuries, and even defaced with forged gold leaf paintings added by a previous owner to raise its value. A team based at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore spent years recovering the text using ultraviolet light, multispectral imaging, and even a powerful X-ray beam from a particle accelerator at Stanford. What they recovered confirmed just how far ahead Archimedes had been. He was reasoning about actual infinities, comparing infinite collections of things in ways that mathematicians once believed originated thousands of years later. The same manuscript also uniquely preserved his puzzle called the Stomachion, and parts of his work on floating bodies in the original Greek. The book by Reviel Netz and William Knoll, the Archimedes Codex, tells the full story of the recovery. The loss was not malicious. Recycling old manuscripts was simply routine when parchment was precious. But so few copies of Archimedes' advanced works ever existed that every single loss was a catastrophe. Think about what this means. The mathematical tools that power modern physics and engineering were glimpsed by a single mind in the ancient world, written down, and then very nearly erased by a monk who needed some paper. We got it back by the thinnest of margins. Number 7. Sushruta's ancient surgery. In ancient India, a physician named Sushruta compiled a medical text whose core material is often dated to around the 6th century BC. It is called the Sushruta Samhita, and it describes a level of surgical skill so advanced that much of it would not be matched in the Western world for well over 1,000 years. The text is staggering in scope. It describes over 300 surgical procedures and around 120 surgical instruments, including tools that resemble forceps, scalpels, and probes. Sushruta is often called the father of surgery, and even the father of plastic surgery, and that second title comes from one procedure in particular. He described reconstructive rhinoplasty, the surgical rebuilding of a nose. Why noses? Because in that era, cutting off the nose was a punishment for certain crimes. Sushruta described taking a flap of skin from the patient's cheek or forehead, keeping it partly attached to preserve its blood supply, and using it to reconstruct the missing nose. This forehead flap technique is not a historical curiosity. It works. And in a remarkable twist, this ancient method reached the West quite late. An account of an Indian surgeon performing the operation was published in a London periodical, The Gentleman's Magazine, in 1794. A British surgeon named Joseph Carpla studied it, and in 1815 he performed the operation himself, after which it spread through European surgery. Sushruta's text went far beyond noses. He described cataract surgery, using a fine curved needle to push the clouded lens out of the line of vision, a technique called couching. He wrote about careful preparation before surgery and attentive care after it. He insisted that surgeons train their hands on models first, practicing incisions on gourds and on the bodies of dead animals. He even advocated the dissection of human cadavers to understand anatomy, a practice that ran against strong cultural taboos of the time. The procedures were carefully classified into types such as excision, incision, probing, extraction, suturing, and puncturing. He described using wine to dull a patient's pain before an operation, an early form of anesthesia. He wrote about leeches, cautery to stop bleeding, and specialized bandaging techniques, and the text covered far more than surgery, including midwifery, eye disease, and the study of poisons. So why do we call this an erased invention when the text itself survived? Because the practical knowledge, the actual skill of performing these operations, was largely lost to the Western medical mainstream for many centuries. Parts of Indian medicine were preserved and transmitted through Islamic-era scholars, forming one bridge to the wider world. But hands-on surgery declined in many traditions, and techniques that had been documented so carefully faded from common practice. Modern reconstructive surgeons still use a version of the forehead flap principle that Sushruta described. The knowledge was there, on the page, for more than 2,000 years. The world simply took a very long time to catch up to it. Number 8. Ctesibius's hydraulics. In the great city of Alexandria, around the middle of the 3rd century BC, an engineer named Ctesibius founded a school of thought that would shape mechanics for centuries. He is regarded as the father of pneumatics, the study of air pressure and its uses. And the strange thing is, not one of his own writings survives. We know him entirely through the descriptions of later engineers. Ctesibius is credited with inventing the force pump, a device with 2 bronze cylinders and pistons that could raise water and shoot it out in a pressurized jet. This may sound modest, but it is the ancestor of the fire engine. Roman-era bronze pumps matching this design have actually been found by archaeologists at sites in Britain and in shipwrecks, proving the technology was real and in use. The pump relied on valves to control the flow of water in and out, an essential feature of every reciprocating pump ever since. He also invented something delightful, the hydraulis, or water organ. It was the first keyboard instrument in history, and it used water pressure to keep the air supply to the pipes steady and even. This makes Ctesibius the direct ancestor of the pipe organ, and through it, of every keyboard instrument that followed. Imagine that. The lineage of the piano begins with a Greek engineer's water machine in ancient Alexandria, and he transformed timekeeping. He took the water clock, a device that measures time by the steady flow of water, and improved it dramatically by adding a float and a regulated flow, making it far more accurate and continuous. His improved water clock would remain among the most precise timekeeping devices in the world until the invention of the pendulum clock in the 17th century, nearly 2,000 years later. Everything we know about Ctesibius comes secondhand through the Roman architect Vitruvius, who wrote about him, and through later Alexandrian engineers like Philo of Byzantium and Hero of Alexandria. His pressurized water jet shows a real, working grasp of hydraulic pressure long before anyone studied it systematically. The concentration of talent at Alexandria, with its famous museum and library, is what made this burst of innovation possible in the first place. And that is also the clue to why it was lost. When Alexandria declined as a center of learning, this engineering tradition scattered and diminished. Because Ctesibius's own texts did not survive, we cannot even be sure of the full range of what he invented. His successors, including Hero, extended his pneumatic ideas into automatic machines and even steam-powered curiosities, but the momentum eventually faded. Consider what he actually demonstrated: control of pressurized fluids, precise timekeeping, the mechanical production of music. These are foundations of the modern technical world, mastered in the ancient one, and then allowed to slip because the institution that nurtured them fell and the words that recorded them were lost. Ctesibius pointed toward powerful fluid machinery. The path was there. It simply was not followed. Number 9. The Chinese blast furnace and cast iron. Iron shaped the ancient world, but there is iron, and then there is iron. Most early societies made iron by heating ore in a simple furnace that never got hot enough to melt it, producing a spongy mass that had to be hammered into shape. China did something different. By around the 5th to 3rd century BC, Chinese metallurgists were building blast furnaces hot enough to fully melt iron and pour it, like a liquid, into molds. This is cast iron, and China was producing it roughly 1,000 years before Europe managed the same feat. The key to reaching those temperatures was a powerful and continuous blast of air. Chinese engineers developed the double-acting piston bellows, a pump that pushed air on both the forward and the backward stroke, delivering a steady, forceful blast into the furnace. It is a genuinely advanced pump design. By the Han Dynasty, which ran from around 206 BC to 220 AD, iron production had become a major industry, at times controlled as a state monopoly, with large foundry complexes. The advantages of pouring molten iron into molds are enormous. You can mass-produce identical objects quickly and cheaply: plowshares, tools, cookware, weapons. Cheap, effective iron tools helped Chinese agriculture flourish, supporting a large population and a strong economy. The Chinese even cast enormous objects, iron pagodas, bridges, and statues during later dynasties like the Tang and the Song, showing the scale their foundries could achieve. Cast iron does have a weakness. It is brittle. So Chinese metallurgists developed further techniques to deal with this, including annealing to reduce brittleness, and a clever process called co-fusion, which combined cast iron and wrought iron to produce steel. Around the year 31 AD, an official named Du Shi is credited with applying water power to drive the bellows for iron smelting, a striking early use of water power in metallurgy. Europe, by contrast, did not routinely produce cast iron from blast furnaces until roughly the 14th and 15th centuries AD. That is an extraordinary gap. For over 1,000 years, China held a decisive lead in one of the most important industrial technologies there is, and the rest of the world had to reinvent it independently. The historian Joseph Needham documented this Chinese advantage in ferrous metallurgy in exhaustive detail. So why did the knowledge not simply spread west and change everyone's timeline at once? The answer is a mix of distance, difficulty, trade barriers, and secrecy. Technologies do not automatically flow across continents. They move along trade routes, through people, and they can be guarded or simply never carried far enough. The blast furnace and the double-acting bellows were mature and widespread within China, yet effectively erased from the wider world's story for a millennium. It is a reminder that an invention can be perfectly successful in one place and still be, from the rest of the world's point of view, a lost opportunity, waiting 1,000 years to be found again. Number 10. The Inca Quipu. The Inca ran one of the largest and most sophisticated empires the world has ever seen, stretching along the spine of the Andes, and they did it without a writing system in the way we usually think of one. Instead, they recorded information on the Quipu, a device made of knotted colored cords. And here is the unsettling part. We can read some of it, but we may have lost the ability to read the rest of it forever. A quipu consists of a main cord with many other cords, called pendant cords, hanging from it, and sometimes smaller cords branching off those. Information is stored in the knots. The Inca used a base 10 positional number system, much like ours, where the type of knot and its position along the cord encoded a digit. Scholars recognize three main knot types: a simple single knot, a long knot made of several turns, and a figure 8 knot, each carrying different values. This much the numbers we can largely read. Quipus recorded census data, tribute owed, the contents of storehouses, and calendar information. They were maintained by trained specialists called Quipu, the record keepers and accountants who kept the empire running. Harvard scholar Gary Urton and the Quipu Database Project have cataloged and statistically analyzed hundreds of surviving quipus, decoding much of their numerical content. But there may be far more here than numbers. The color of the cords, the direction they were spun, the way they were twisted and attached, all of these may carry additional meaning. Some researchers believe certain quipus encoded narrative information, names, stories, perhaps even a full language-like system. In 2005, Urton and Carrie Brazine identified what may be a marker for a place name in a quipu from a site called Puruchuco, a tantalizing hint that identity and words, not just quantities, could be woven into the chords. If that is true, then the quipu is not just an accounting tool. It is a unique, three-dimensional, tactile form of writing, unlike anything else in the ancient world. And we cannot fully read it. Why not? Because the knowledge of how to interpret the chords lived in the trained minds of the Quipu, passed down by teaching, not written in a key we can recover. When the Spanish conquered the Inca, they often destroyed quipus, seeing them as idolatrous objects or as tools of resistance. They suppressed their use, and within a few generations, the specialists died out, and their reading skill died with them. Only around 1,000 quipus survive today, scattered in museums and collections, many of uncertain origin. In some Andean villages, local quipus continued in use for record-keeping into modern times, preserving fragments of the tradition. Modern computer scientists now study the quipu as a fascinating example of a physical encoding system. But the deep question remains open. We are holding an archive from a lost empire, and much of it we simply cannot read. If the full system had survived, it might have revealed an entirely unique Andean way of storing human knowledge. Instead, conquest scattered the key and left us staring at a code we may never fully crack. Step back from these 10 stories and look at them together, and something clarifies. In almost none of these cases did the technology actually fail. The South-Pointing Chariot worked. The Haya furnaces produced steel. The rubber bounced. The Roman saw cut stone. What failed again and again was not the invention. It was the chain that should have carried it forward. You can sort these losses into a few clear types. There is erasure by conquest, where a culture and its knowledge are deliberately suppressed. The Mesoamerican rubber tradition and the Inca Quipu both fell this way, their specialists scattered and their practices forbidden. There is erasure by economic displacement, where a working technology is simply undercut and abandoned, as when cheap colonial imports killed the Haya steel industry. There is erasure by lost texts, the fate of Archimedes and Ctesibius, where the knowledge depended on fragile documents that were scraped away, or simply never copied enough to survive. And then there is the quietest kind of loss, erasure by narrow use. The South-Pointing Chariot, the Hierapolis Sawmill, and Al-Jazari's programmable machines were never destroyed at all. They were confined to ceremony, to a single proud monument, to palace entertainment. They were never generalized, never asked the crucial question, what else could this do? A brilliant idea, kept as a curiosity, is only one generation away from being forgotten. The common thread runs deeper than any single cause. It is the difference between knowing how to do something and building a system that keeps and spreads that knowing. Craft skill held in a few expert hands is fragile. A single manuscript is a catastrophic bottleneck. Knowledge treated as an elite marvel rarely reaches the scale where it can transform a society. Understanding why these particular inventions vanished tells us something uncomfortable about how easily any knowledge can slip through our fingers. That pattern of loss did not happen by accident. It grew out of how knowledge was actually stored and moved in the ancient and medieval world, and understanding those mechanics explains a great deal. For most of history, a text survived only if someone kept copying it by hand. Stop copying. and the work slowly disappears as old copies rot or burn. Parchment was so scarce and valuable that scraping clean an old manuscript to reuse it, creating a palimpsest, was routine, which is exactly how Archimedes' greatest insight nearly vanished. Great libraries, like the one at Alexandria, concentrated knowledge in a way that made them single points of failure. When they declined, whole traditions went with them. There were human barriers, too. Craft guilds and states guarded valuable techniques as secrets, limiting how far they could spread. When iron production is a state monopoly, as it was under the Han dynasty, the knowledge is controlled by design, not shared. Languages divided knowledge into pools that only translation could connect, and translation was rare and slow. It was often through Islamic-era scholars, translating and preserving Greek and Indian texts, that ancient learning survived at all to reach later ages. When empires collapsed, the trade routes and scholarly networks that carried ideas across regions were severed. Technologies that thrived in one place stayed there, sometimes for 1,000 years, as the Chinese blast furnace did, and some knowledge was never written at all. It lived in the trained hands and memories of specialists, the Haya smelters, the Inca Quipu Mayocs. That kind of knowledge is only ever one broken generation away from oblivion. When the practitioners are gone and no key survives, the knowledge does not just fade. It becomes unreadable, locked away in objects we can hold but no longer understand. Which raises the obvious humbling question: how much have we already lost and never even knew existed? The honest answer is that these stories are full of open questions, and that uncertainty is part of what makes them so compelling. We are still reconstructing, still arguing, still digging. We do not know for certain the exact internal design of the South-Pointing Chariot, whether it truly used a differential gear or some other clever arrangement. We do not know whether the Haya furnaces produced consistent steel in every firing, or only sometimes. The precise recipes and ratios behind Mesoamerican rubber are still being refined. We do not know how widespread the Roman crank and connecting rod really was, or whether it was a rare specialty. We do not know the full list of Ctesibius' inventions, because his own words are gone, and we do not know whether the Quipu encodes a readable language or only numbers. Beyond each individual puzzle lies a larger unknown. How many other Archimedes works were lost completely, leaving no palimpsest to recover? How much surgical or technical knowledge existed that was never written down, or written on materials that did not survive? Somewhere, there may be undiscovered manuscripts and unexcavated sites that could rewrite these timelines yet again. Every reconstruction is limited by the fragments we happen to have, and that is precisely why the work of clawing this knowledge back matters so much. Here is the hopeful turn. For all that has been lost, we are living in a remarkable age of recovery, when science is pulling erased knowledge back into the light with tools the original inventors could never have imagined. Consider the Archimedes palimpsest. Text that a monk scraped away 8 centuries ago was read again using ultraviolet light, multispectral cameras, and X-rays from a particle accelerator. Consider the Haya furnaces, reconstructed by elders working with archaeologists. Their inherited memory captured before it could vanish. At MIT, chemists reproduced ancient Mesoamerican rubber by analyzing old samples and testing plant recipes. Engineers have built working replicas of the South-Pointing Chariot and the Hierapolis Saw, confirming that these designs really function. The Quipu database project is applying statistics and computing power to the knotted cords, chipping away at their secrets. Experimental archaeology recreates ancient smelting to test how it truly worked, firing reconstructed furnaces to measure the temperatures they could actually reach. Museums have rebuilt Al-Jazari's Automata from the instructions in his surviving book, and scholars like Donald Hill translated his treatise so a modern engineer could follow it step by step. Modern surgeons acknowledge that Sushruta's forehead flap principle still lives on in their operating rooms, more than 2,000 years after he first described it. And perhaps most importantly, we now digitize and openly share what we recover, creating redundant, distributed records, a kind of insurance against ever losing this knowledge a second time. Each act of rediscovery does more than restore a fact. It reveals, again and again, just how ingenious these vanished inventors really were. So, could these erased inventions have changed the world? The truth is, in a sense, they already did, wherever and whenever they were used. The Haya made steel. The Inca ran an empire on string. Archimedes touched the edge of calculus. None of these were failures. What we lost was not the invention. It was the thread that should have carried it onward, so that each breakthrough could build on the last. That is the quiet lesson hiding in all 10 of these stories. Progress is not a straight, unbroken line marching upward. It is a fragile relay race, where knowledge must be passed carefully from hand to hand, generation to generation, or it is dropped and lost, sometimes for 1,000 years, sometimes forever. A single scraped page, a single conquered city, a single generation that stops teaching, and a piece of human genius simply falls out of the story, which leaves us with a thought worth carrying with you. The inventions that shape our world are not just the ones that were made. They are the ones that were kept. And every one of these erased marvels is a reminder of how much depends on the simple, precious act of remembering and passing it on.